This is Becoming Inclusive from the Kaleidoscope Group, where we're thinking differently about diversity, equity, and inclusion for more empowered people at work. We're committed to real change, and that begins with real conversations. Welcome in.
Hi, I'm Reggie Ponda, and welcome to another episode of Becoming Inclusive. I am here with my co-host once again, Catherine Potts. Hey, Kat, how are you?
Hey, I am happy to be on here. I'm good.
And we somehow were able to pull Jerry Jones, the Global Director of Design and Development, into our conversation today. Jerry, welcome, man.
It is so good to be here. Thank you, Reggie.
So Jerry, firstly, I said somehow was able to pull because you are so busy. And I like it when we get the global people onto the show because we get to talk about things that are not just U.S. based. And that's really what we're going to do here today is that the U.S. really doesn't own the whole discussion, the whole area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we've talked about some of this in some of our other podcasts, but really want to delve a little bit deeper into that. So set the table for us here.
Yeah, well, when you said that, the first thought in my head was, yeah, but it feels like we do, right? Like it feels like the conversation and the reality is, and I think why we're talking about this here, the reality is it doesn't just feel like that for us. It feels like that for people around the world. In fact, a lot of times we hear when we take on an international client, regardless of the country, there's a little bit of tentativeness. There's a little bit of fear, maybe, that what we're going to be bringing, what we're going to be presenting, is just more of this U.S. narrative, just more about everything that they see in the news that oftentimes gets dominated by what's happening here. But they've got their own stories, and they've got their own backstories and history, and their own narrative. And really, I think if you want to have a good conversation with anyone, you really have to connect to their heart. And so the way that you do that is that you dig into their story and listen to what's important to them. And when you go down the trail of that backstory, when you backtrack and see where they're coming from and what their history is and what their own narrative is, then you stumble across the reality that we preach all the time, that this is important for everybody, that when you pay attention to this, it's good for you. Regardless of who you are, not because of what's happened here, regardless.
So you bring up two questions that I'm going to ask both of them, and we can talk about them later, but I don't want to forget them. The first one is, you said connect to your heart. A lot of times when we talk to business is really connect to your profits, connect to your revenue. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that. And then my second question, are you telling me that George Floyd is not relevant around the world?
I feel like you're setting me up, Reggie. No, I'm absolutely not saying that. In fact, I think that the George Floyd narrative is one of those narratives that has rippled far beyond our borders and has made an impact around the world. One of the most enlightening things you can Wikipedia is George Floyd protests outside of the U.S. Yep. There's it's over 60 countries where people connected to it. But, and here's where I would lean in just a little bit, is that I think what connected with those people is the part of the George Floyd story that connected to who they are. There's something in that story that all of us connect to: the gap in power, the power inequity, there's so many pieces. And like every piece of that story. The injustice, all of it. Yeah. And people can connect to all of that, just like we can connect to other stories, but we don't do it until it hits us in the heart, right? Like we don't really connect until we can connect it to our story somewhere. I forget what your first question was, because
well, you actually were coming back around to us, but that was so good. You said it doesn't do it until it connects to our heart. And I'm saying,
Right.
well, from a business perspective, is it really connect to our heart, or is it really connect to our pocketbook? Is it to connect to our revenue? Is it to connect to our profits and how well our company is doing?
Yeah, you're getting into the heart of why we do this work and why companies even attempt to pay attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's a big question, right? When you talk about why, somebody always comes at it from. In fact, it's almost natural to talk about it from a business perspective. And we believe strongly, hey, diversity, equity, inclusion, when you do it right, not just when you drop it in and stir it up, right? When you do it right. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, it boosts your innovation. You've got people thinking from different perspectives, and there's tons of research to support this. There's a lot of research out there. It boosts your innovation. It boosts your connection to the marketplace. When you've got people inside your company who look and act and think and speak like the people who are in the marketplace, it absolutely boosts your connection to the marketplace. And when it's done right, it boosts profitability. There is a lot of research out there to show. And it doesn't just boost your profitability because you add diversity at any place in the company. There's a great article from Harvard Business Review that talks about what you really have to pay attention to is the power structure and the people who are making decisions. And that's where diversity needs to be represented. That's when you get the benefit of diversity. And that's the business perspective, right? So one of the things we've done recently is take a look at it from the employee perspective as well. So you've got people making decisions for the business, but what about the employees who are working inside of that business? And again, when you do it right, it changes everything for those employees. It creates a better workplace. It's connected to mental health. I know you all have talked about this as well with other guests.
Yep.
It's connected to employee engagement. It's connected to retention. And when all of that is right, it connects back to the business. So there's like heart and business. Because when you've got a better workplace, you can attract better talent. And when you can attract better...
And the people are the heart of the business, right?
Yeah,
You're going to have
absolutely.
no business without the people there kind of making that heartbeat, right?
Right. Absolutely. And the other perspective that we've looked at it from is just the human perspective. From a humanity perspective, it's the right thing to do, which is one of those arguments. And we argue as if, hey, which one is it, right? Are we doing this because it's good for business or because it's the right thing to do? And we'll fight about that. I mean, people, I've seen people get upset about that. But the reality is it's all of those all the time. It's always good for business. It's always good for the workplace. It's always the right thing to do. And so you can't separate business from heart. Not if you want to do it right, and not if you want to receive the benefits at any of those levels.
Wow, I love that. Go ahead, Kat.
Yeah, no, I just want to kind of go back a little bit to where you were talking about sometimes the apprehensiveness of, places outside of the US worried about, the whole narrative thing, right? Mm-hmm. Because what makes me think about is like, so, here in the US, right, we talk about DEI, and one of the things that we have to think about is like diversity of thought of different people, right? What's going to impact each person. So it's interesting that it wouldn't be as like intuitive for some, right, to realize that people outside of the US have a different narrative, like the same way that we have to customize that in the US, right? It can be the same way on a global level. And I can understand sort of the fear of someone or a company in another country thinking like, are they going to be able to switch that? But I think that almost is just talking about the same goal, right? Because really that's the essence of DEI, whether it's in the US or it's in another country, is basically trying to express to them that that's exactly what DEI is, right? It's not to sort of push this one narrative. And so it's interesting because it's also saying that those other corporations outside the US really do have the same goal because of that worry, right? They're already kind of in the right position and their foot's already forward. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And that's go ahead, Reggie.
So I want to, I don't know if necessarily push back, but maybe get some nuance here on what Kat said from you on this one, Jared, is that while customized in the U.S. The real issue is that theoretically, I guess customization is the same, but when we go to other countries, it's not exactly the same, right? So it seems the same, but it's not exactly the same because there's the issues are a lot different. That whole U.S. narrative at least can have some relevance across the nation, even if people don't agree with the narrative. But when we move to some of our some other places globally, it just doesn't make any sense to them.
Yeah. So I'm going to push back really quick before Jerry gets to go. No,
I came into it
before Jerry gets to go, because I think about too, though, that's assuming that the people within the business in the U.S. are from here too, because other part of this too is we have to be careful about that narrative even here. Because the people that are in the U.S. company may not originally be from here, could have come over here just for work. We don't know their situation. So I don't know that it's true, Reggie, that we can push that narrative and still be inclusive even in the U.S.
That's why we have Jerry here, and that's why we have you here as well. So thank you so much for that.
You both are jumping in deep, and which is good. Like, you don't get to do DEI without going deep, right? And you don't get to do DEI and be comfortable. We talk a lot about. In fact, I think I talked about this on your podcast before with Trisha. Just the difference between safety and comfort. Right. We want to create safe conversations, but we don't get to create comfortable conversations. And really, if we want to do DEI work, we have to have those uncomfortable conversations. And really, like, what we're doing here is we're peeling back layer after layer after layer, which you need to do if you really want to have this conversation. So, and when you get down deep enough, you get to the heart of what we're talking about. What's the value of doing this work? It's in the humanity of all of us, right? Like, we're talking about treating people as humans, finding their voice, closing the gaps that inequity creates, all of that. Like, and it's so vital, regardless of the story. So a great example of this is whenever you ask, and we'll do this sometimes with clients, is just say, hey, what are the first words that come to mind when you think about diversity? Reggie, what is it? What comes to mind?
When I think about diversity, well, one of the first words is race.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that happens from a U.S. That is absolutely from a U.S. perspective. I'm from the U.S. I'm African American. One of the things I think about is race. The other thing that I always think about is gender. So I think about race and gender when I hear diversity.
Yeah. And Kat, you said generation?
Yeah, generational. I think that race, but for me, I don't know why the generational diversity is such a big one for me. And that's probably because of my like work experience and it being like just a huge factor in a lot of different things that have gotten me to where like I am now. But that's like a huge one for me.
Right. And all of those have a story attached to them. All of those. And we've got our own personal stories.
Right.
We've got our own stories of people that we're connected to, stories of people that we love, things that we've seen in the news our entire life. All of those are connected to a story. And yet, when we talk, for example, when we talk about race in the U.S., like we could go down that trail again. What's the first thing that comes up? It's like we all know, right? We know those stories. That's been a part of our existence and our narrative forever. However, when you go to many parts of Europe, the history of race is much different. So, like a simple example of that is. Like you've got parts of Europe where racial demographics were once collected for Holocaust reasons, right? They were collected for the sole purpose of eliminating people of that race. Well, when you follow the trail back to where we are now, you get to a place where when we talk about race, it's triggering those thoughts and those ideas and that history and that narrative. And so even to bring up the word race triggers something completely different than would be triggered in us here. Here's a very relevant conversation, and we all attach to those stories, and we need to talk about it. For them, it's not about saying that there is no inequity there based on race, but just the word triggers something different. And in fact, in many places in Europe, it's illegal to collect demographics. And so, DEI organizations are going in there and saying, all right, let's gather your statistics. How many people of color do you have in your workplace? And they're like, what? First of all, we can't collect those, and we wouldn't collect those. That's wrong to collect those, that information. And so you can't go in with the same slide deck and expect to have the same results, right? Like that's a great example. And all of those things that you mentioned are dimensions of diversity. They're things that make us different, and they're places where inequities can occur. They're things that happen inside of a company that create differences, that create a different experience for one person than another, for one employee than another. And those things have to be paid attention to, but you got to pull back the layers before you can get to that. So we're talking about the same thing. We're using very different words to talk about it. So
I'm a country in Venezuela, and I'm in Venezuela, excuse me. And I'm saying to the DEI people who are coming to talk about DEI, I don't really need DE&I. I just need better business practices. How does that land?
Yeah, let's pull back the layers. If people are hung up on language, then I'm a big fan of having that conversation first, right? DE&I, diversity, equity, inclusion. That's the language that we have adopted that has become an industry. But it's really about the conversation that lies below that. So this happens actually quite a bit. Equity is a hard thing to understand, right?
Yeah.
Diversity, we can get there, but equity is hard to understand when you speak English. When you speak a different language, it's a whole different layer of hard to understand, because in many languages, there's not a word that is translated equity that means anything except for it's a banking term, right? It's a financial term. And so while you're presenting about equity as if they understand it, they're translating in their head, but there's this point of confusion. Why are we talking about banking stuff in the middle of this thing that's supposed to be about people? So you have to drop below the words, and if the words are a barrier, then you've got to get deeper than that and help people really grasp that what we're talking about is people, how people are treated, how people interact, how people are heard and understood, where their voice comes from, and how to really drive that.
And I think too, it can be kind of, some people would think, doesn't diversity and inclusion include equity? Like some people could imagine when you explain equity, be like, well, doesn't diversity and then the inclusion part kind of fill that gap? Like, why do you need equity, or what does that mean? Because if we have those two things, right, it's assumed that we are creating equity for individuals, but actually, I think we've all seen where that's not totally the case.
Yeah, and those are all relevant thoughts and processes that people go through as they begin this work. When you speak the same language, right? Like that's when there's not the extra layer of translating. Whether that be in your head and language is not just about words. Language goes far beyond just understanding what's being said. There's culture, there's depth, there's nuance and story that is all plays into that, and those can be barriers for people. When we come in and just start talking about it. So it's not just, hey, our U.S. narrative, but sometimes it's the words that we use, the language that we use as well. Yeah.
So you really kind of got into it, but I want to get a little more exact on this. So what are you saying, Jerry? When the Kaleidoscope Group goes out to companies that are beyond the U.S. borders to talk to them about DE&I, do we have an approach? Is there a specific way in which we try to talk to, guide, and advise companies that maybe is a USP.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first line of, I won't even call it defense. The first line of offense on that is that we've got a global team, and by that we don't just mean people. And here I am representing the global team, and I'm the straight white American male, right? Like, however, what I love is that when I joined the global team, I brought diversity to the team. Our team is from around the world. We've got people who speak different languages, who come from different places, who live in different places. We also work with a number of people all over the world, and that's really like that's the linchpin in all of this. Like that is the piece that holds it all together, because you can't go in preaching this message. Hey, we understand that it's not about the U.S. narrative if everybody looks and acts and talks like me. You just can't, right? You'll break that trust instantly. And so we've got a team that's stacked with people from all over the world, and we're continuing to grow. We're continuing to do it more and more. We're looking for more people from around the world who can represent us and really represent us when all the layers are peeled back. Right? That's the challenge. Is we got to find the right people from all over the world who can share the heart of this message. And I think that's one thing that KG does really, really well.
Great. No, absolutely great. So I'm going to ask a question that's probably because I got you. I got you here.
Okay. All right. It's a setup.
This is the issue on women and equity. Is that when we look around the world, the cultures around the world, even firstly, you talk about the word equity, it just doesn't mean the same, and right, people look at it differently. But then when we just talk about culture, where women being leaders, and there's places where that doesn't happen. How do you have a discussion about women and equity and mobility and ownership and power when maybe those countries are just not ready for that?
I want to add to that really quick too, because I think this is something we've talked to Floor about too in the past, just like how leadership ideals look different sometimes at a global level generally. So I do want you to also answer about women specifically, but just generally DEI and what they see as optimizing their leadership being different based on culture and that type of thing.
Yeah.
And how does that show up?
Yeah. You have to pay attention to the cultural norms, to what is, because like we mentioned before, you're getting into a heart level. You have to start with the heart, and the heart is shaped and formed from birth on up. And so some of those core ideas around leadership and gender and really all of the dimensions of diversity. Some of those core ideas it's not just something that you can go in with a slide and say, you should think about it this way. And then they change their mind, right? Like, I'm so glad you shared that. I'm going to change everything my parents ever taught me. You can't do that. So there is absolutely patience involved. There's listening. There's a
So it looks like Jerry might have got a little frozen there, but it's so good to have him on to talk about this cat, because you and I from our U.S. purchase are sitting over here. We're talking about the stuff, and we have these questions, but it's really, really great to talk to the people like Floor, to talk to people like Jerry, to have them come in and talk to us about how, from a U.S. perspective, we think we're leading everything, but that's not always the case.
And I think from a U.S. perspective, we also want to take that, like, we can do it no matter what position. Like we're good. We can lasso everything. We can make everybody happy. We understand everybody.
I know how to do this.
Like invincible type of thing. And I can understand why that could be unattractive to other countries, depending on how we're entering that business relationship.
Yeah. Hey, am I back?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you're back. You're
All
back.
right, yeah, and I love where you went with the conversation. It absolutely, and that not only is a reality for us, like we can be like that for sure. We know that about ourselves. That's a part of our reputation around the world as well, and we come preloaded with that that reputation, and that's where the fear comes from, right? You're just going to talk to us about this U.S. narrative, and so unless we can really come in with humility and say we're here to listen, and we're here to recognize what's important to you, and we've got the goods. Like we also have something. When you peel back all of the layers, we've got something that can help you from a business perspective, employee and human perspective.
Wow. Well, look, Jerry, as usual, we're so happy to have you here. I take away a couple of things from this discussion, and I'll give you the last word, but these are the things I take away. The first thing is that U.S. narrative is not the only narrative. Everybody has a story. And what you're saying is that we need to listen to those other stories as opposed to overlay the U.S. narrative.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the first thing that I get. The second thing that I get, and I got this real strong, is it doesn't matter what you call it. Doesn't matter what words you use, is that it's good to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, however you mix that up and however you change those words, for everyone. It's good for everyone. And then the third thing that I got is that it's very, very important that whomever companies use to help them through that journey, to make sure that they have people who are from those countries who come in with a global perspective. That's what I got, but I'm gonna give you the last word here.
Well, all of that, Reggie, you're so good. Like you could have done this podcast by yourself.
Don't get into confidence too high, Jerry. Not today.
Sorry, Kat. I've created a monster.
Never again.
Absolutely. Like all of what you just said is actually a really great summary of that. And I would say that common language is important. And so it's not that words don't matter, right? And if we can come to the place of understanding using the words diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's a great place to start. If we can't, then we've got to peel that back and be willing to listen and really get into the heart language. What was the last thing you said?
I just said that in terms of teams, to make sure that your teams have people who are either from those countries, but just not. This is a diverse team. If we're talking about diversity, make sure that team is diverse and diverse globally. Yeah.
Diversity makes us different. I think this is where I was going when I got cut off, and I'll finish with this, is that when a company looks at diversity, equity, and inclusion from the inside, and we hear this all the time, we're already diverse. Look at us. Like we've got people from different countries. We've got people who speak different languages. We've got, and you're all still white men. Right. Or you're all still this, like there. And when you look at it from the outside in, you get a different perspective, because then you ask the question that we ask a lot. It's what diversity is missing that would make us better? What voices are not here that would give us that innovation, that would give us that connection to the marketplace, that would boost our profitability, but would also be the right thing to do, that would really connect us to the world and connect us to the people around us. And that's at the heart of what we're trying to help people do, is ask that question. Not just how do you get more diversity? If you don't know why you're getting it, then what's the point? The question for businesses, for organizations, for companies, for people is what would make me better? Like what would make us better, and what's missing right now that could be there? Everything you said, Reggie, everything you said, Kat, like it's all good stuff, and this is a great conversation that could go on for days.
Yeah, definitely.
Kat, anything?
No, I mean, both of you summed it up really well. And I actually want to have Jerry to come back on, because I really do think there's another conversation around how to approach leadership on a global level, but then also how does that relate to when we are in the States too? Because there's things to be learned, yes, at a global level, but then how can we also bring that global lens to the United States and the opportunity that we're losing right here, but by not using that global lens here?
Well,
yeah, you just went full circle, Kat. Like, that's brilliant. Because, in our arrogance, sometimes we think we can do it all. We think everybody should benefit from what we've learned and all the lessons we've got. And peeling back one layer of that is, hey, let's listen to them so we can help them, right? What you just did is peel back another layer and said, let's listen to them so they can help us. Like, what can we learn that would, and that's the reality, is if we shut ourselves off of that, we're missing out on some huge benefit that could come from all over the world.
Wow. Well, that's our show, you guys. If you don't know, that's Jerry Jones, the Global Director of Design and Development. And that's Catherine Potts, the co-host. I'm Reginald Ponder. Thank you once again for joining us for Becoming Inclusive. And we'll see you folks next time.
And don't forget, everyone, download, subscribe, tell us what you like, tell us what you don't like. We really enjoy that feedback.
Thanks for joining us, and a special thanks to our subscribers. Consider becoming one today. Becoming Inclusive is presented by the Kaleidoscope Group, your full-service diversity, equity, and inclusion partner serving clients worldwide. Learn more and continue the conversation at kgdiversity.com.